During my discussion and conversation with various people involved with spiritual work, two particular religious texts have often been recommended to me: the Tao Te Ching and the Bhagavad Gita. So a while ago I decided to read the Bhagavad Gita, and this will be my comment on it, based on the notes I wrote down while reading it. I want to preface this commentary by saying that I have not read all that much about Hinduism, and it is a religion with many different schools and interpretations. But the Bhagavad Gita is considered the essential text of Hinduism, so I will be evaluating that text according to timeless principles. The Gita makes the claim of being timeless, as it should be, but the need for correct interpretation of its jargon almost makes this claim irrelevant. Things should be clear, not hidden in obscure or ancient jargon. Luckily, there is commentary provided in the version of the Gita I read by one of these Hindu Swamis, Swami Sivananda. But the point still stands, as we shall see. The language, stories and metaphors about the higher self, portrayed as Krishna, creates more of a separation than referring to this concept as the real self. The aim of unity with the real self or internal observer is indeed the timeless aim of religions. Here they call this observer Krishna, or the causeless cause, or Parabrahman, and so on, which indicates that we're dealing more with internal, psychological manifestations rather than external or physical ones. Krishna, Brahman self, is also correctly associated with the unmanifest cause of everything, saying, I am the goal, the support, the Lord, the witness, the abode, the shelter, the friend, the origin, the dissolution, the foundation, the treasure house and the imperishable seed. Krishna is God, split up into the conscious witness in each thing. The gods are all aspects of one deity. There are three primary yogic paths: Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and Jnana Yoga. Karma Yoga is basically meditation or discipline focused on non-attachment to the fruits of action. You do what your body or environment requires, but place no particular value on it. Bhakti Yoga is basically meditation focused on single-minded attention to the idea of the primal cause, or God, or nature, a kind of reverence for everything, and particularly for the source of everything. Jnana Yoga is meditation focused on self-knowledge, such as learning about the higher self and the various energies in the body. It seems they praise each path as the superior one, to create interest in the person drawn to a specific path. Emphasis is on non-attachment or detachment. Attachment is regarded as a demonic trait, which is accurate. Says the self does not slay ties and errors, but that wisdom or understanding does. That's accurate. Even a wise man acts in accordance with his own nature. Beings follow their nature. What can restrain do? The emphasis on the lack of free will or helplessness seems to be a form of provocation to make people act. Says that one's nature, that controls us, is part of a duty that is fundamentally good. This sounds basically the same as my own conclusions, that the nature of things serve a specific function. I like the following part. Better is one's own duty, that is nature, though devoid of merit, than the duty of another well discharged. That is to emulate someone else's nature, even if you can do it well. Better is death in one's own duty, nature. The duty or nature of another is fraught with fear. Says, thou art the unseen seer, the unthought thinker, the unheard hearer, the unknown knower. Some of this is actually pretty good, even brilliant. I can tell that some of the ideas I come across elsewhere and people I've discussed with and learned much from were probably influenced by the Gita. But the actual text claims that the transcendental I is above the 5 elements, including ether. That seems inaccurate to me, as it does not correlate with what I found in Western traditions. The 5th element, ether, should be a metaphor or symbol of the transcendental I or inner observer, when the elements are taken psychologically, as primarily they should. And later commentary in the Gita does compare the self with ether, as if they are the same, that the ether can't be destroyed. Implies that only what is permanent or timeless is real. Everything impermanent is unreal. It is difficult to tell whether the story about Arjuna and the war is meant to symbolize an inner psychological conflict or attitude in life in general. Even though the Swami translator explains in the introduction that the real battle is within you, the enemy king is your own ignorance, etc. But even with this prefaced explanation, which doesn't always come across in the actual text, it's sometimes hard to remember this while actually reading the Gita. And because of this, it can easily be misinterpreted in unsound ways. For example, non-attachment could lead to indifference in soldiers or people with a war mentality, making it easier for them to kill. It also says, further, having regard to thy own duty, thou shalt not waver, for there is nothing higher for a kshatriya than a righteous war. So duty here must mean becoming one's true self. But in today's world, I think the phrase righteous war leaves a bad taste in the mouth. The commentary says, the scriptures declare that if a warrior dies for a righteous cause on the battlefield, he at once ascends to heaven. But again, what heaven other than the true self? The text needs to define what it means by heaven, what it means by righteous war. Otherwise, it just sounds like any old subjective or crazy war propaganda with religious undertones. It's unfortunate, because there's a lot of other things to like in the text. And here is another contradiction. The Gita has emphasized non-attachment and impartiality, but suddenly says, people too will recount thy everlasting dishonor, and to one who has been honored, dishonor is worse than death. So we're no longer being impartial. A non-attached person wouldn't care what people think of him. Only if the dishonor is a metaphor for internal shame is there some logic to it. Because later on it encourages you to rise above the pair of opposites in honor or dishonor. But even if we give the Gita the benefit of the doubt, it still doesn't communicate it clearly. Communication is the most important thing. Says action has to be performed through the force of nature, so perfection is not ceasing to do, but by doing all actions as a divine offering, imbued with a spirit of non-attachment and sacrifice. Yes. Nature is made up of 3 qualities called gunas, sattva, rajas and tamas. It says sattva is attachment to happiness and knowledge. Rajas is thirst or intense desire. Tamas is crudeness, recklessness, ignorance and habitual. These 3 natures suppress each other. I assume they mean this both in the individual and in society. The 3 parts of nature are called worlds. Obviously, the nature that it talks about here is human nature, basically instinctual drives. I would assume that this correlates with the tripartite division of the psyche or soul in most traditions, meaning intellect, emotions, and vital sensory motor energy, what timeless education refer to as sapientiam, gratum, and morum. Based on the descriptions, I don't know what else they could mean. Unfortunately, if this is what they mean, then the text becomes a bit problematic, as we will see. The Atman, or inner observer, to use a more clear language, is beyond these 3 qualities and their functions. Only when knowledge of this fact dawns in man does he attain perfection. Yes, you could put it that way. One should do his duty according to his nature, and that doing duty that is suited to one's nature in the right spirit of detachment will lead to perfection. Well, this is basically on the right track. You should be yourself, follow your nature, but still not take it too seriously, since your nature is not you, it's nature. You are the inner observer or Atman. Among the gods, Brahma is the predominance of Rajas, Vishnu the predominance of Sattva, and Shiva the predominance of Tamas. However, all 3 gods are pure beings in the sense of being guiding principles of these concepts. But in that there is again a problem of communication, since principles shouldn't be given human-like shapes. The need to represent everything within Hinduism, even non-being, as entities or gods, is what made Buddha want to reform Hinduism into Buddhism. To represent void or pure awareness as a god ignores what is important in the concept. Buddha recreated a more easy to understand teaching about the inner observer as not possible to describe, like a void that's invisible. Buddhism is in some sense proof that the older jargon of Hinduism and other religions was unnecessary. However, Buddhism has some other problems that I will not go into here, so it's not perfect either. Now, getting back to the three gunas or parts of the psyche, it is said that tamas should be cast out, rajas should be controlled and mastered, and sattva should be cultivated and conserved to become self-realized. And it is odd to me that one part of nature should be demonized like tamas is here. Why not say instead that it should be transformed? The description of nature is odd, since the gunas are called purity, passion and inertia. If the gunas truly are the sole cause of action, then one of them should represent cultural hypnosis, otherwise it's inaccurate. But that the body is evolved from the three gunas suggests they are energies. But they also portray the sattvic quality as not just intellect, but some enlightened virtue, saying, an action which is ordained, which is free from attachment, which is done without love or hatred by one who is not desirous of any reward, that action is declared to be sattvic. Tamas appears to be based on neurotic tendencies, saying, unsteady, dejected, unbending, cheating, malicious, vulgar, lazy, and procrastinating. Such an agent is called tamasic. The three natures are then seemingly described as a threefold division of intellect. It seems like a mixture of different concepts jumbled together. And this brings us to the most controversial aspect of Hinduism, namely the hierarchical caste system, which is based on these three types of natures. I suppose it would be fine if they stated that sattvic people were the enlightened ones, and tamasic people are people who still need help to develop themselves. But if that's what they mean, then it is not made clear at all. Instead it says that people are born with these qualities due to karmic causes, thus reinforcing a kind of fatalism and places you seemingly permanently in a specific rank. And with this comes an element of exploitation according to hierarchy, with the promise of a better life next time. It says in the commentary, when a man does his duties rightly according to his order of life, his heart gets purified and he goes to heaven. It is only ameliorated with the statement I brought up previously, that it's better to do one's own duty, though destitute of merits, than the duty of another well performed. He who does the duty ordained by his own nature incurs no sin. One thing that must be discussed here is also the concept of rebirth or reincarnation. The Gita says, one who has true union with the Lord is not subject to rebirth. He attains immortality. Again, there are words being used without proper explanation or definition. Whether or not someone is reborn or escapes that and ascends to this heaven or whatever, isn't he still immortal regardless? That was the argument at the beginning of the Gita when Arjuna was told that killing anyone in war doesn't matter because the soul is immortal. People will be reborn. Again, we need to know what is meant by the soul, what is meant by the Lord, what is meant by rebirth, what is meant by heaven, and what is meant by immortality. The only way this can have any consistency with timeless principles is if none of this is taken literally. The soul should be the inner witness. The Lord should be the highest natural law. Rebirth should refer to a change in attitude or psychological state. Heaven or immortality should be coming out of these changing psychological states into a healthy permanent one that understands it is pure awareness, and so forth. Otherwise, the statements actually contradict the highest natural law and timeless principles, and thus it will not lead people down the right path. Then this strange passage comes out of the blue. The Creator, having in the beginning of creation created mankind together with sacrifice, said, by this shall ye propagate. Let this be the milk cow of your desires, the cow which yields the desired objects. I suspect that creator here refers to the higher self, and mankind refers to inner psychological aspects. Cows are a metaphor of religious texts containing wisdom, which is the milk. That cows are considered holy in India is probably because they take this symbolism literally, because it makes no sense to regard one animal as more sacred than another. That implies attachment and partiality, and many animals are useful to man, not just cows. The Gita understands the power of cultural hypnosis, saying, "Whatsoever a great man does, that other men also do. Whatever he sets up as the standard, that the world follows." It doesn't specify if this is good or bad. After all, the world follows also mediocre and even bad men. Anything that is in the spotlight, the world often follows and imitates. Says, with the mind centered in the self, free from hope and egoism, and from mental fever, though thou fight. That hope is linked with egoism is a good observation. People must give up their hopes and silly dreams before spiritual transformation is possible. Dharma means righteousness, and righteousness appears to be reaching the higher self. Unrighteousness, adharma, is that which goes the opposite way. Karma means action as in a type of work. Sacrifice to the gods is sacrifice to the ways towards the higher self, giving the credit for all action to God. Other types of sacrifice and courage are strange. Self-knowledge is what overcomes sin. Knowledge is the great purifier. Yes, correct. A big part of self-knowledge is I do nothing at all. Action is done by God or nature. Says God is time, movement, that devours all. Nothing else is in control. Physical renunciation of objects is no renunciation at all. What is wanted is the renunciation of egoism and desires. The number 9 is mentioned, but it doesn't clarify the meaning of numbers. Mentally renouncing all actions and self-controlled, the embodied one rests happily in the 9-gated city, neither acting nor causing others, body and senses, to act. The constant assurance that someone unattached and resting in Brahman attains happiness is likely not convincing for most people. They need to reconcile the statements about being detached to killing and being intent on the welfare of all beings. To be intent on the welfare of all beings sounds like a preference, not non-attachment. In timeless education, I recommend supporting life, since it makes you feel like you contribute and serve a purpose, making you feel more fulfilled. But the Gita gives no such argument or reasoning. The Gita throws out too many statements without providing a good argument for them. And later on it says that you cannot injure anyone, which I assume must refer to the impossibility of destroying the soul. But you can still injure people emotionally, psychologically, and the motor function in this life. The Gita says the sage is verily liberated forever. Forever is quite a claim, sounds like hyperbole. Liberated for the rest of this life would be more accurate. Also, the meditation practice described sounds a bit dogmatic. There are many ways to achieve liberation. The Gita is possibly guilty of some eternity blindness, stating, Arjuna wishes to know the fate of the aspirant who fails to realize the Supreme in spite of his faith and sincerity. Krishna tells him that the accumulated power of his yogic practices will assure him a better birth in the future, with more favorable conditions for sadhana. The aspirant will then be compelled to carry on his yogic practices with greater vigor and faith, and will finally achieve God realization. The 3 types of death are not properly delineated. Are they talking about physical death, spiritual death, or identification death? Whether death refers to psychological death or not is unclear. Here it should mean the death of one identification, if it is to follow the essence of real religion. Leaving a body should mean leaving an identification. Because if the Gita means unity with the higher self only after physical death, it is inaccurate. I mean, listen to this statement. Whosoever at the end leaves the body, thinking of any being, to that being only does he go, because of his constant thought of that being. The 12 adityas should be the 12 temporary shapes or psychological attitudes in life, that is psychological reincarnation, but the Gita is vague about them. The higher self is the goal of knowledge. He who knows spirit and matter is not reborn, appears to imply not identified with lower nature, but it is obscure. All duties have been accomplished when a man acquires the knowledge of the causeless cause. Hell is lust, anger and greed. Yeah, that sounds like Buddhism. To conclude, based on the language or jargon alone, as well as the lack of proper definitions in many instances, I cannot place the Gita at level 1 in the evaluation compass. Even if the content is timeless, and much of it appears to be so, I think level 2 is a much better fit. If the Gita truly was written by people with higher consciousness, then it should not have that language. More likely it was written by people who were inspired by what enlightened people had revealed, while not being fully enlightened themselves. The book has the flavor of tradition passed along, without much of the original theory left intact. The risk of misinterpretation is high, and my relatively high score also assumes that my interpretation often is correct. If I am not correct, then the Gita cannot be considered timeless, so keep that in mind if you are critical of my interpretations.